On this week's episode, we'll hear from Declan Burke, Director of Strategy at SSE. But before he had that job, he was a senior civil servant in the UK's Energy Department. So he has particular insights on working in government and in private industry and how the two can work together to deliver a clean energy transition.
Declan, thanks very much for joining us on this episode. You've got a fascinating job in that you're in charge of coming up with the strategy for SSE, which we know is a relatively large energy company. So I want to talk about that, but you've also had a great career previously in terms of public service, and we'll come back to that. So you've been deeply involved in energy policy for a long period of time. Let's start though on SSE and your current role. You're Director of Strategy. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And what is the strategy?
Thanks for inviting me along. So I joined in September of last year, so I'm still kind of relatively new. A really interesting role. So group strategy, we can look across the entire range of activities the group does. So I guess what we're particularly focused on is strategy's it's called NZAP Plus, so Net Zero Acceleration Plan. So the group plans to invest over £20 billion between now and 2027, right across the energy sector. So that includes building renewables, so offshore wind, but also onshore solar, batteries, that sort of thing. Then we build the networks to move that electricity to where consumers need it. The big ones, transmission and distribution, bring it into your home. And then critically, we provide flexible generation. So if the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, how do we make sure consumers still get affordable, reliable power? So I guess one of the reasons I was attracted to SSE is we're right across that value chain. And in my last role as a kind of a policymaker, you try and think of energy as a system. So you can see those different pieces. So charting our way through what is a pretty dynamic market and thinking about I guess where there is a real growth, risk and opportunity across the group is what we focus on. So, yeah.
And what is the big problem that this strategy is trying to address then? So, Net Zero Acceleration Plan, presumably it's about net zero, but what's the big thinking behind where you're allocating this £20 billion the next 5 years?
So I suppose kind of net zero itself kind of came from the Climate Change Act to 2019. It was a big thing for the Theresa May government, one of the other flagship things she did while she was in power. And that commits the UK to have a net zero economy by 2050. And I suppose the economy bit's an important bit. So today, although we've made a lot of progress decarbonising power, 50-60% coming from low carbon sources, if you look at the whole economy, about 75% of the energy we use still comes from fossil fuel. So by 2050, you're going to have to decarbonise transport, heat, a lot of industrial applications. And probably one of the main things you're going to be doing is electrifying, so putting more things into electricity. So a lot of people think you're going to probably double the demand for electricity between now and 2050. So that's where we come in. Not just then generating that electricity, but critically, I think in the last year, one of the things people have really focused on is having networks that can efficiently move that to where consumers need it. So, you're not constraining and you're using that renewable power as efficiently as possible. And to get those different pieces of the puzzle, so, renewables, which will be the backbone of the system, then you have the networks to move it around. And then you have some sort of low carbon, we'll maybe come on to things like carbon capture and hydrogen that kicks in when the wind isn't blowing as much. And if you get the right balance of that, that's what's going to give consumers, low carbon but reliable and secure as well, that trilemma people talk a bit about. So that's the big societal challenge, I suppose, as a responsible utility, we're playing a big role in solving.
So that is a massive challenge though, and this is one company that'll be playing a part in that. But it's a challenge that has lots of challenges within itself, doesn't it? I mean, we know about some of the issues around offshore auctions that have been. Maybe you want to explain a little bit behind that. But what are the big challenges in delivering the kind of investment that you want to deliver?
Yeah, you're right. There's lots of opportunities, but for sure it comes with challenges as well. So if you look at, you mentioned renewables and offshore wind. So we saw some challenges running through the supply chain over the last year. So, these turbines are getting every bigger. There's like 14, 15 megawatts. Remember when I started my career, I went to look at a 3 megawatt turbine, which is enormous. But now, 3, 4, 5 times as big. So I think the supply chain, some of the inflationary shocks we saw on the back of Ukraine and the energy crisis was working its way through the system. So I think people were used to these things just getting ever lower down in cost. So I think there was a while before policymakers recognised actually, that costs have come through and there needs to be some adjustment. I think other things that, pose challenges and industry needs to work closely with government would include things like, consenting and planning. So you're building things in the real world, just making sure communities are being taken with you when you're doing that. And thinking about the whole system. So that's why I mentioned, like, not just thinking about generation and renewables, but making sure you're thinking of networks. And you want to build a network, it may take you 10 years to build that network. So you've seen government move to have more of a planned approach, whereas in the old world, it was kind of one by one by one. The scale of the challenge is so big, it probably needs industry and government to work even closer together. So you've seen, like, the future system operator and some of those things come to life. I used to work in nuclear a bit in my last job. You're seeing the state think, what's the right efficient boundary where we harness the innovation of the private sector and the private capital? But at the same time, the state has a role to play as well in some of those enablers, I would say.
And are we moving fast enough? Because in the UK, we've got this target of clean power system by 2035. The Labour Party would like to have that for 2030, even more ambitious. It's now 2024. As you say, kind of progress in the past has been incremental. We need a radical change. Do you think we can deliver any of those targets?
I'd say they're achievable, but really, really stretching. I think that the pace has to really pick up, I would say. So, AR5, didn't bring forward the level of
That's the auction round where
exactly.
developers find out how much they might get supported in terms of developing some of these.
Exactly right. So, that didn't bring forward maybe as much renewables as the government wanted. You can't have many more like that, I think. Like, hopefully the AR6 or future allocation runs for renewable support. And then I think in things, one of the areas that probably needs to make a big jump forward is like low carbon, flexible generation. So that's things like, a gas plant with carbon capture and storage or low carbon hydrogen. So there's bits of the jigsaw puzzle to get to 2035 that are maybe behind where they should be. So from here, you do think the pace is to really pick up if you're going to hit those targets and almost approach it in a different way. It's not necessarily kind of moonshot territory, but just really mobilize government and industry. And have a bit more pace behind it, I would say, which is not straightforward, right? There's some complex things buried in these kind of things, but faster is needed.
But you think some of these targets are actually achievable? It's just a matter of getting some rocket boosters underneath some of the policy and industry relationships.
I think that's right, and taking well-judged risks, I would say as well. From my old job being a policymaker, some of these things when you're creating industries almost for the first time, they do need to be pump primed, and you're always slightly worried you'll kind of get that wrong. Offshore wind is a great success now. We saw the benefit of competition. But in the early days, my first job was the early CFDs for offshore wind, and I was working on that. They were £140 a megawatt hour. They were pretty expensive. So there is this journey where you need to kind of pump prime markets into being, and then you get competition and the private sector takes over. So that at more pace, I suspect, is going to be an important piece of the puzzle.
Just tell people a little bit about that career you had before that then. So you joined SSE, what
September?
September of 2023. But before then you were in government. And was it largely energy roles you were in?
Yeah, mostly. So I started my career in banking. After university, I worked at Deutsche Bank, a German bank, for about 8 years. And then I moved into a corporate finance role on the government side. So it was kind of a bit of a transition. And probably about 10 years ago, maybe just over, I moved into what was then DEC, the energy department in the UK. I think it had been set up not for very long before, and the first thing I worked on was called the Electricity Market Reform Programme. So that gave us things like the contract for difference for renewables, capacity market, and then some of the institutional architecture that sits around that. So it was a fun time to join.
So just explain to people what a CFD is, what a contract for difference is, and then how did the UK end up with that system, and what was it hoping to achieve?
So a contract for difference, if you're a renewable provider, it gives you a fixed price to sell your electricity. Let's say, £60 just for the sake of argument. So if you build a turbine for 15 years, when you sell your electricity, you're guaranteed to get £60. Now, if the market price is lower, let's say it's 50, you'll get topped up £10 by the consumer. Equally, if you sell your power for £70, you'll give £10 back to the consumer. So it sort of equalises.
Why was that a good system? Why did the government think, actually, that's that works for us?
The reason is because when you build sort of a renewables project, you're spending a lot of money up front in building it, like your capital expenditure. And then to run the thing is very, wind is free and your maintenance costs are very low. So you're going to take a big investment decision up front, and then you need some certainty around long-term revenue. Of course, the energy markets are pretty volatile. So in exchange for that, making that big upfront commitment, you get certainty from government. The thing that came before it was called the renewables obligation. So that just gave you a bit on top of the price that kind of bounced around. So the benefit of the CFD is it sort of is both ways. So during the energy crisis, I used to sit on the board of the low carbon contracts company, and actually a lot of the CFDs were paying money back into the LCCC and then back into the consumer. And as we've seen costs go down and down and down and down, consumers paying less and less and less, The other big thing it allowed government to do was to kind of create these auctions for support, and it's amazing. Like, you started at £140. They reached £40 at a minimum. I think we're probably going to go up a bit from there. But this idea of creating an investable product that the city was comfortable with, you could mobilise capital, and then you could get this sort of competition running through. The supply chain invested and innovated, and you got bigger turbines. So creating that investable product was probably the big win there in terms of policy.
And it worked.
It really worked, and the offshore wind sector in the UK has been, probably the biggest in terms of deployment. And if you look at the kind of that innovation it sparked, as I say, like wind turbines, lots of things are being project financed now. They attract the kind of capital they need. So it's been a great success story. And I think it'll probably be a bit of a template for other things.
So I was going to come on to that. So offshore wind in the UK at least, pretty much regarded as a success story.
Yeah.
But in order to get to a clean power system, we do need new technologies. We've talked about carbon capture and storage.
Yes.
The hydrogen. Perhaps you can explain what they are, and then what are the lessons for developing those new industries that we can learn from the success of the CFD and offshore wind in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the classical thing is if the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, what's coming in, and it'll be a mix of things. So if the wind's off for like an hour, maybe batteries will play a role. Batteries are something we develop in SSE as well, or pumped hydro, which is a big kind of Scottish thing. So Corey Glass, our project up in Scotland, for example, will be like basically a big water battery. So those things will be really important. But then for a longer duration, things like carbon capture allows you to have a gas plant, and then basically you have a sort of exhaust system that captures the CO2, puts it under the sea. And it'll feed into a network of pipes to store carbon dioxide under the ocean, which will also be used by industrial applications and lots of other things, potentially blue hydrogen as well. So government is developing business models for that. And what they're looking to do is provide and think about what's the right risk the private sector should be taking. So you run your plant efficiently, you build it on time and on budget, and you dispatch it in the way that is good for the consumer. But you provide some long-term certainty as well, and it's that kind of business model government's working its way through at the moment. So they're consulting. There's a degree of complexity with carbon capture because you've got lots of different things using these pipes. So what happens if the pipes are not working, for example? So you get some interface risks and complexities, and the same is probably true of hydrogen as well. So those are the business models that government are consulting at the moment. We've got projects up in Scotland, Peterhead, and in Keeby at the Humber, and a bit like an offshore wind. I think early progress is just really important. You learn a bit by doing as well. So I think they're getting closer and closer to having a business model. But what risk should the private sector take to make it investable? What risk should government take? Because it's not in consumers' interest to try and price those sorts of tail risks, for example.
And with your experience in government, then one of the questions is about pace.
Yeah.
Is government a place where you can actually deliver pace? And especially the pace that we need to deliver a clean power system.
It's incredible, government's got a lot of really hard-working people in it who put, I think people are surprised actually when they join the kind of the civil service, just, the level of commitment, how hard people work. And when government puts its mind to it, it really can, like, the CFD, offshore wind. So I think it absolutely can. I think these are complex things to put together, I suppose. So, big companies are complex, but when you have multiple government departments, that introduces a level of complexity as well. Obviously, we've got an election on the horizon, so I think that probably adds another degree of complexity if you're working the policy-making side. But the UK has got lots of precedent of creating investable propositions. I suppose the thing that is going to be important is, as I say, taking conscious risks. Like back, the offshore wind looks like an absolute triumph now. It was a bit riskier back then. Everyone was like, well, why would you build it in the ocean? You can just build it on land. So for things that are going to be important, like some of the stuff we've been talking about, just pump priming those markets early doors. I think that's the thing that, I hope my former colleagues, I'm sure they will be working really, really hard on.
So you think the civil service, the government, they actually can pick up the pace?
Yeah, I think so. I think if they've got the mandate, if you've got the mandate, you really need to get across the line. And as you mentioned, if you want to deliver in 2035 or even, 2030, you sort of know what the jigsaw puzzle pieces will be. I worked in the energy white paper, I think it was around 2020. And we were sort of approaching that. There's a lot you don't know about the future energy system. Imagine trying to project 30 years' time. Like, what will that look like? If it was 30 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted today. You can simplify it a bit by saying, what do I know I will need? I'll need a ton of renewables, a lot of networks, and then I need to open up these pathways for the other things I will need. It was carbon capture, hydrogen, nuclear was one of the pathways we talked about in that report. So you're going to need to make progress on these things. So the sooner you make progress, the sooner the private sector will be innovating and driving costs down.
And I can see why, if you work in the energy department, you can see that puzzle.
Yeah.
And you can think we can actually build that, and that makes absolute sense, and that helps us deliver this policy. Yeah. But as you said, these are complex systems. So building a plant or building transmission networks, for instance, which is going to be, as we rewire the UK, it's going to be a massive challenge. That is a lot of other departments would presumably have interest in that. We talk about planning reform, consenting reform. There's obviously environmental considerations we all have to think about.
Totally.
Is it just too complicated to get done quickly?
That's a good question, Raymond. I think, first of all, like when you talk about transmission, that confidence to the supply chain, because lots of other countries are doing this at the same time. I think that's one of the reasons why the visibility is even more important now, because you've got a lot of countries looking for the same supply chain skills and people. Which is even more the case maybe than it would have been sort of 10 years ago. I think in a way to address some of those challenges, almost nobody else can do it but government, I suppose I would say. So I think when, it's probably an overused example, but if you look at things like national emergencies, COVID, Ukraine, if you get that real energy into the system, and it probably needs a strong leadership from the centre. So you'll have all these different government departments, but then, someone kind of knocking heads together at the right place and at the right time, I think is important. And probably being honest, that there's a degree of trade-offs. So, you want to engage local communities, but you will have people sometimes who'll have differing views. So how you make sure you're kind of bringing them along. And obviously we spend a lot of time on local engagement as well. But for some of those sorts of things, government is going to play an important role for sure.
And we expect an election to take place here in the UK in 2024.
Yeah.
As somebody's been in there in the heart of government energy policy, what are your top tips for whoever gets in?
Change of government's always an exciting time. So you're sort of preparing these folders for the new government, and people will be reading their manifestos. I think, I'm sure both parties, obviously the existing party's been there a long time. Labour is spending a lot of time talking to business, and they've got people in there preparing them for government, I suppose. But I think the first 100 days is like a new job, right? And the first 100 days will be important. And they'll be setting out their priorities, organising their departments. Probably the thing I think a bit about is the wiring across the different government departments and that kind of clear steer from the centre. I think that's probably one thing. And then for me, it comes back to this sort of well-judged risk. Like you'll have to take risks to make this sort of stuff work in this sort of time frame. So where are you going to take those risks? And making sure they've got enough, of the kind of delivery capability on the government side as well. Like they don't need to do what the industry is doing, but they just need to make sure they're understanding the kind of the risks the industry are facing up to.
If you're a civil servant and it's general election year, is that something you meet with dread or excitement? Because I can just imagine the hassle is quite significant, the uncertainty is quite significant. And
yes, it's definitely a big thing. There's been quite a few of them, of course, recently. But I don't know, sometimes it can have a frisson of excitement going through the civil service. It's a big thing. So there's been so many recently. I suspect that the machine's pretty well set up. I suppose what you haven't had recently is a change in governing party. So that's the thing that's probably quite a big change, I suppose. So really understanding what's in their manifesto, and civil servants will work really hard to understand what their priorities will be coming for an incoming government. But especially at the more senior levels, I think the machine's well capable of adjusting to it.
I've certainly got a view that I think policymakers, are, along with engineers and project managers and all these sorts of people, absolutely key to delivering the clean energy transition. Do you think the role of policymakers is sufficiently appreciated?
That's a good question. I think sometimes the hard work of the civil service probably isn't sufficiently, because they're often trying to balance competing interests, and if they go one way or the other, if they kind of pull the trigger on a project that doesn't really work, they'll get kickback, and that could damage the wider agenda. So how hard people work in that space, I'm not sure it always is. Including ministers and their special advisors as well. Like people, especially I think on the net zero agenda, really put their back into it. Nothing but respect for the world of the civil service.
Why did you leave when you could have stuck around?
Said all that,
an exciting time in energy. I mean, we've got probably 10 years to deliver the current government's clean power plans. I mean, if you're an energy geek, and I'm guessing you are, then this is prime time, isn't it?
No, for sure. I think it's interesting to see it from a different angle. So I talked about designing policies, and on the nuclear stuff, you'd be more surprised at the similarities and the differences, I suspect, in some of the kind of teams within the government department. So you're sort of investing directly into projects, you're worried about governance and delivery and all those sorts of things. So there's quite a lot of similarities, I would say. And I started my career in the private sector, so I was sort of keen to move back into the private sector and maybe just get that a little bit closer to delivery. So I've enjoyed, since I've been here, going out and seeing teams that are really actually building, substations or renewable projects. So seeing it a bit more firsthand. And I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, actually, people cycling in and out of Whitehall a bit, because then you realise, that's why they're worried about that problem. You can sort of see it firsthand, which I think is, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
If you walk back into your old department today, what would you be telling them?
Oh, SC is a great place to work. Obviously, Raymond, lots of really friendly people. I think there's a real commitment, willingness for industry to kind of to mobilise, and certainty is quite important, because we talk internally about what do we need: people, supply chain, innovation. If you're going to invest in those sorts of capabilities and get the best people and all that, having that pipeline of forward plan is really, really important. So minimising uncertainty, I would say. Competition is fine. I think everyone kind of is fine with that. But I think maximising certainty, just given how much there is to do. And I think for me, it's that bit around, like, we've made a big push in renewables, big push in networks, that kind of enabling a renewable system, flexible generation. That's probably the bit that needs to catch up a bit, I would say.
Now, you're director of strategy, so where do you get your information from? So we're in an industry now which is growing very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
Talking about millions and millions of people working clean energy globally.
Yeah.
People watching this will be thinking about their own careers and how they develop and how they keep ahead in this industry. You've been in energy for a long period of time. What's your advice to people in terms of how they can get the information they need to succeed?
That's a good question. I think there's lots of great information out there on the sector. So there's lots of really good podcasts, obviously including this one, Raymond. There's things like Aurora, Baringa. A lot of the consultancies do podcasts, and they'll often get really interesting speakers there as well. I think if you read newspapers, FT, energy is kind of front page material, I think, post-Ukraine. So what's going on with gas prices, it's really kind of mainstreamed as a conversation. And then I think getting out and meeting people, LinkedIn's probably pretty good actually these days. You get a lot of interesting commentators on there. And in our line of work, looking at equity analysts and the banks and what the markets are saying, they can be a pretty good indicator of what's going on. So especially a bit like a honeybee, you're kind of gathering information all over the place a little bit you can. What's
your advice for somebody who's interested in policy, interested in strategy, interested in how we actually deliver this, starting out their career? Yeah. What would your advice be to them?
So I think we were looking the other day at kind of because we were doing a bit of recruiting at the moment. What are the kind of things we're looking for? And it is the sort of like intellectual curiosity. Thinking about, because the thing that's really exciting about energy is it's that kind of Venn diagram of technology, political, commercial. So it's all these different things, geopolitical, coming together. So you don't have to be like a deep expert. Don't be put off by the acronyms and the technology and all that kind of stuff. I think if you've got an interest in the agenda and just try to get your foot in the door a little bit, I suppose. And even if you don't start on strategy or policy directly, as long as you've got some exposure to the sector, I think you can play your way into it. And we've got a guy just joined our team recently, actually, who was more engineering on the heat network side elsewhere in the SSE group, but he's interested in working in strategy. So yeah, if you find a little berth in the sector somewhere, you can make your way across.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to wind up shortly. Before we do, though, these are big questions. What do you think is the biggest challenge for delivering clean power here in the UK?
The biggest challenge? I think probably policy movement in the areas we've talked about. So, let's get those kind of business models up and running. I think stability and consistency. There's been some, turbulence for all sorts of reasons over the last year. Given how much time we've got, I think that will be really important. And then I think concerted effort on those cross-cutting enablers. So, consenting and planning, but really making the effort to take people with us. Local communities are really important, and that consumer voice is important as well. So, net zero isn't some sort of an imposition. We shouldn't forget the prices we saw on the back of the energy crisis. Like, if we get this right, you'll have low-cost, secure, and low-carbon energy. That is the thing I think we can achieve. So I think there's the technical bit, there's the enabling bit, and then there is that societal engagement bit, which I think is a job for probably governments and industry as well.
And you're optimistic it can happen?
Yeah, for sure. I think in our line of work you sort of have to be a bit optimistic, or certainly my previous role. So I think it definitely can. And I think if you sort of have that mindset, like, here's where I'm going to be, and you just break it down, and you're just like eating an elephant, you go bite-sized, have a plan and execute on it. Yeah, definitely.
And what would be your message to some in the industry who might be a bit frustrated at the pace at which government goes at? I mean, these are your former colleagues as well. Yeah. So, should we give them a break?
Love them and former colleagues. I think a degree of frustration is not a bad thing. I think pace is really, really important. So I think that's understood on the civil service side and on the government side more generally as well. So I think maybe where we started the conversation, there will need to be an acceleration in areas. So I think just all around a degree of healthy frustration and impatience is probably not necessarily a completely bad thing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Declan.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.